Okay, we're going to switch gears here, and I'm going to talk after proclaiming my expertise in how to successfully publish. I want to step through a paper that has been successfully rejected. This particular paper is a pet project of mine. I really like it. It went through 3 rounds at the Academy of Management Journal, and just recently got rejected. And so tomorrow, actually, I am going to meet with one of my co-authors, and I should give a shout out to my co-authors, Rebecca and Juan Lee. Juan is at St. Mary's University, which is a college, I'm not sure, but it's very close to here, as is Rebecca. And as you'll see, much of the textual material that we're dealing with is written in Chinese, and so it is Juan's expertise that resolves this. This paper captures my current issues in language and the role of language in managing change. And in the little bit of consulting work that I do these days, I interact with some top-tier change management consultants who say that if you want to change an organization, you need to change the language. And many of them will come in with lists of words that you can't use and lists of words that you shouldn't use in order to promote concepts of change. If you're interested in that specific subject, there's a very nice paper in AMR by Ford and Ford from the late 90s about the connection between language and change. But in this context, I really enjoy the opportunity to focus on the Chinese Communist Party because they use, let's call it what it is, they use, I like to think of rhetoric as persuasive language. They use propaganda. They use propaganda very, very well. And I think we can learn from them. And that's the intent of this paper. So I want to start out by reading out this anecdote because it really captures the empirical thing we're going to describe. This is a fable, a modern day fable told by the Chinese economist Zhang Yang to describe the phenomenal change that is taking place in the Chinese economy. A village uses horses as its primary work animal. In this allegorical world, horses are creatures that complain unrelentingly and demand food insatiably, yet provide little labor in return. In contrast, zebras are the opposite. They're efficient, they're tireless, and loyal. After many years of poor result from using horses, the village chiefs realized that the village would benefit more if horses were replaced by zebras. However, this is not a small change. For many years, the village heads had extolled the virtue of horses, condemned the vices of zebras, and the villagers had come to accept that horses were good, zebras were bad. The village chiefs patiently embarked on the delicate work. Every night under the cover of darkness, a few villagers began painting black stripes on a few of the horses. Each morning, everyone was surprised to see these animals, but were assured that they were indeed their own horses with a few harmless painted stripes. Nights went by, more and more horses were painted, but with all the painting going on, everyone was still assured that these were certainly horses, not zebras. After they became accustomed to life among the painted horses, the leaders made another gain under the cover of night. They began replacing a few painted horses with real zebras. Quickly, the zebras proved their worth in the field, and as a result, village life clearly improved. But all the while, the leadership maintained that these zebras were just horses, albeit with artfully applied stripes. Gradually, people became accustomed to life with the real zebras, and they started to conclude that these animals might indeed be zebras, and that zebras were not so bad after all. Only after another long interval, well after the horses had all been replaced, well after many seasons of prosperity, did the chiefs gather the citizenry and proclaim officially that this was the village of zebras, and that zebras were good. This is an allegory used to describe the gradual introduction of elements of capitalism into a communist economy. It is an artfully told story, but it's very, very similar to what we would describe as the boiled frog syndrome. That if you want to make dramatic change, you do it incrementally in baby steps so as to not shock people who have a demonstrated capacity for continuity. But what I really like about the story is that it problematizes our notions of change, that it talks about change occurring within a context of continuity. And we tend to think of change in relatively simplistic terms, but we don't distinguish, for example, changes in practices that may take place over time and continuity in language. or change in language that may take place over time, and continuity in practices, and how those things come together eventually over long periods. So let me contextualize this, though, by describing, I guess, how remarkable the Chinese economic reform actually is. So if you look at this chart, which tracks it from the early 1950s to 2004, what you see is a very, very dramatic period of change that starts incrementally in the 1980s and moves by the 1990s into very, very dramatic adoption of capitalist practices. The first elements of change happen at the end of the Cultural Revolution. This is the privatization of agricultural projects and the creation of these economic zones, these free economic zones that occur. That happens in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It starts to accelerate in the 1990s, particularly with the adoption of the transfer of Hong Kong to mainland China. And then what you see is that in 1997, when the Asian financial crisis occurs, that wipes out the economies of most of the countries in that area, China is unaffected. The degree of growth takes place is absolutely phenomenal. But what's even more surprising for me is the fact that in spite of the adoption of all these very, very profound elements of institutional change in the country, that the Communist Party manages to maintain its legitimacy and status and continuity. And that's really shocking, because if you look at the examples that have occurred in other communist countries that have adopted Western capitalist practices, they do so sharply, and they do so with a very, very rough transition period in which, for a period of time, during the transition, the economy gets totally disrupted. And you can see this in the shift in the GDP that took place in Russia when it transitioned from the Soviet Union to Russia. It experiences a real calamitous period of economic change in which people suffered tremendously during that stage. And of course, the other consequence in that transition is that the old institutions start to fall in order to accommodate whatever places. Now, the folks that I've talked to with some expertise in Russian history suggest that these old institutions never actually go away, and what we're starting to see in Putin's Russia now is a reemergence of at least some of the practices of the old Soviet Union, and that may well be the case. But my key research question in this is then, how do the actors legitimate revolutionary change, which is what we see in China, by masking it as a form of evolutionary stability, or in the empirical context that we have here? What is the rhetorical strategies by which the CCP managed to persuade people that capitalism was actually a good thing, and maintain the formal institution of communism? And you can see from this that it really captures my interest in institutional change. Much of the institutional literature has really trivialized change. They talk about the adoption of new marketing practices, or the adoption of new organizational practices, but they don't really capture institutions in the way that the historians or the economists talk about shifts in institutions, whereas this empirical context is a real profound change in institutions. And so I just want to very briefly touch back on my original comments about this sort of simplistic understanding that we have of change and stability and their relationship. And when we look at organizational change, we tend to focus on a specific aspect of an organization, draw a box A that says state A at time 1, and box B, state B at time 2, and we have this assumption that that things have changed. And typically in those studies, things actually have changed. Nothing wrong with that. But in the midst of all that change, there is a degree of continuity that occurs as well. It tends to get ignored because no organization changes everything all at once. We understand that that's a terrible way to implement change management practices. So we have this unfortunate discrete notion of change as moving from time A to time B. We also have this sort of binary thing where there is again, in the context of institutional theory, there's isomorphic change, which is change toward a common goal, or divergent change, non-isomorphic change. We also talk about revolutionary and evolutionary change. And again, no question that those things occur, but there's no appreciation for the complexity of the fact that these things may actually occur at the same time. And that's exactly what we see in the context, the empirical context. The other problem is that we tend to understand change best. This is going to sound a little wikey and a little sense-making, but we tend to understand change best looking backwards rather than understanding change when we're in media res, as the drama people would say, in the middle of the action. And one of the best descriptions of revolutionary change I've ever seen is John Reed's famous book, 10 Days That Shook the World. In this book, he's trying to describe the mass confusion that took place. He was an American reporter on site in Moscow during the revolution in which the Communist Party first emerges. And retrospectively, it all makes sense that this was almost a naturalized progression because, of course, the winners tell the story about how that occurred. But at the time that Reed was on the ground there, it wasn't entirely clear which factions were supporting which policies and who would emerge as the winner. And had the white Russians dominated, we would have a completely different understanding of the process of historical change that occurred there. So from that, I take notice of there is the empirical fact of what changes, and then there are the stories that we tell after the fact about how change occurred. And both of those things form our understanding of change, but they aren't necessarily, it's not easy to tease those two elements apart. And so later on, I'm going to introduce this term, rhetorical history, which is to focus our attention on not only what happened, but more specifically how we talk about collectively how we talk about what happened historically. That is, how the actors who have an interest in how the past is perceived and collectively remembered describe the process of change. And so this is a term I introduced some time ago with colleagues in a book chapter in strategic management. And it is one of those things that seems to have resonated with a large group of people. The sources of this, at least for me, were drawn from literature and sociology, particularly this notion of invented tradition. So Hobsbawm and Granger published this book in the late 1980s where they talk about how many of the taken for granted practices and institutions that we think have existed for a long period of time are actually fictitious. They're made up. And so one of the descriptions in that story, in that book, is a journal that tells a journal article that tells the story of the invention of the notion of clan tartans in Scotland. We tend to assume that way back in the 13 and 14 and 1500s that the folks in Scotland ran around in family groups called clans and wore these tartans. The reality is that was a narrative made up by largely English politicians who were trying to position Scotland as an important part of the evolution of the political structure in Britain, largely in the mid-1800s, and very successfully so. Or another invented tradition is the Christmas address by the monarchy. The monarchy is very good about doing things that are relatively new, but pretending as if they've done them all the time. Of course, the invention of a radio as a new medium of communication was immediately recognized by the monarchy as an important element of social control, and they knew they had to participate in it. So they started this tradition of the Queen's Address at Christmas time, and when they did that, they didn't say, "Oh, this is a new thing." They acted as if they had always done that. That's what institutions do. They act as if whatever they do is continuous and historical and traditional. It also draws from this notion of collective memory, which is an idea that the sociologist Hult had. He had this notion that, and this is something that I'm exploring in other work, that we tend to think, because we valorize, particularly in the Western rational account, we valorize the individual so much, we also have this assumption that our memories are the unique property of individual experience. Actually, that's not entirely true. And there's a lot of psychological evidence in this, which I'm just stepping through. A lot of our memory actually is informed by the institutions that we live in. We've all had like the family, for example. We've all had this experience of growing up in a family where you're constantly remember when you did this as a child. And of course, you don't have an actual authentic memory of that, but you hear the accounts of it so often that you absorb that into your own personal autobiographical memory. And the literature that the psychologists use is exactly that phrase, autobiographical memory. Much of our memories are shaped, constrained, and actually planted by the institutions that we live in. Another fascinating discussion. So putting those two things together, the history of actual authentic experience and the way that we talk about experience at an institutional level is how we come up with this notion of rhetorical history. The other thing that's interesting about this subject area is that rhetoric, of course, has always had a very, very high and important position in Chinese politics, going back to Confucius's time, but also reinforced by Mao Zedong. This is a culture whose history is really told by anecdotes, much like the painted horses one that I introduced, but based on these often repeated and carefully constructed stories about how we ought to behave that can be traced back to the analects. Much in the same way that our own Western cultural account can be traced back to fables that we inherited from the Greeks, Aesop's fables that get retold and retold, which restructure our collective memory about ethics and appropriate behavior in all sorts of contexts. The nice thing, though, is that Western rhetoricians are very, very sensitive to the persuasive and emotional impact of wordplay in context of Chinese propaganda. They use the word scientific formulations, but there are a tremendous number of catchphrases and words that I'm going to show you in a second that talk about these sort of scientific formulations. And for those of you guys are probably too young to remember this, but during the Cold War, with respect to the relationship that the West had with China, there were all these phrases that sounded really awkward and clearly in the context of propaganda to us, but actually had a degree of resonance and influence in China, like the running dogs of capitalism. I can remember in my law school class when we were writing our essays, our final papers, we would have to, as a game, we took these aphorisms and had to work them into our final essays, and I got the running dogs of capitalism. So that's a particular favorite one. But these phrases, these scientific formulations are so important, and there are so many of them that the folks at the Hong Kong University back in the early 1990s constructed a dictionary of all these phrases. There are literally hundreds of them have permeated into the years. So in terms of the data sources that we use for this, we're focusing specifically on the scientific language of the CCP. We look at all the formal communications they have for these national congresses and plenary sessions, which are incredibly important. We look at it from the period just after the Cultural Revolution, when Mao is no longer an influence, to 2016. And the particular focus is on the political report of the CCP, because this is a document that is a major vehicle for the preparation of policy. It's like the president's address to the union, but it actually is much more communal than that document, in the sense that there are lots of people, lots of bureaucrats that have input into what that precise phrasing is going to be. I just got to back up and tell you a really funny thing. So one of the experts, the Western experts on the drafting of the CCP political report, was written by a text by a guy called Liu, who used to actually be one of the bureaucrats that actually wrote this. And I discovered this book, and I thought, oh, this is brilliant. I got to talk to this guy, and I'll fly anywhere in the world to meet this guy. Turns out he was at the University of Victoria, right next to me, three buildings down. Small world that we live in. So what we looked at for data sources here is we looked at these 8 congresses, but the 8 congresses are supplemented by a series of documents that hide behind it, including resolutions, decisions, communiques, speeches, proposals, and media coverage that occurs from the official newspapers. These are the organs of the CCP. The primary emphasis, of course, is on the speeches used in the Congress. We ended up with about 243 documents, or a little over 2 million words, which is what you'll see. We apply a form of topic modeling analysis to this. This is actually quite a small data set for topic modeling analysis, but we wanted to learn how to use this, so we thought this was a good introduction to it. So our focus is on these slogans that they call formalized linguistic formulations. We did it in 4 stages. First, we did a content analysis to find out which of these phrases are used most frequently. Then we interpreted how the phrases change over time. The changes are, in some cases, very, very subtle, very slight. And then we wanted to validate it by using topic modeling analysis, which I'll talk about. And then we did a sort of a confirmatory analysis by, so the original material was not translated into English, but we had those documents translated. Then we did the usual comparative analysis with me involved at that stage at the paragraph level. And then we introduced some experts who are people from political science studies in China to see whether or not an interpretation was correct. We ended up looking at 4 formalized or scientific phrasings. There is an important shift, an important but subtle shift between referring to Mao Zedong's thought and Mao Zedong thought. And the shift is a reference to Mao Zedong as a person, as an icon, as a god on one hand, and an abstracted version of Mao Zedong thought on the second hand. I'll explain what I mean by that. Anyone who's spent any time in China will be familiar with this idea of socialism and Chinese characteristics. There is a reference to a subtle shift between planned economy to a social market economy. You can never use the word private property because it was tried to be introduced as early as one of the congresses in the early 1980s and was immediately rejected as being too radical a change. And then the introduction of this phrase called the public ownership system. What we see with each of those is an example of different types of casuistry. Casuistry is a type of rhetorical strategy. Was really introduced by Burke, although he didn't talk about specific subcategories of casuistry, and he actually talked about it as a broader rhetorical strategy. But I'll explain what it means in a broad sense first, and then I'll give you the empirical examples of what occurred with each one of those scientific phrases. So the basic idea of casuistry is that you take an original idea. And is there a question? Sorry.
Should we wait until the end?
No, please interrupt me now. Let me
so, if you go back one more,
yep.
About the content analysis.
Yes.
How did you do this content analysis? Was it mostly human, or was it? Did you use a machine learning tool?
We used both. The first stage was entirely human. I'm still very mistrustful of the machines. So in the first stage, we did it the old-fashioned way, which would be the reading through the documents, looking for doing first order coding, second order coding, and all that. We didn't do it on the entire sample set, but we did it on a significant amount of it. More than half of the documents were done the old-fashioned way. And we interpreted, and then we came up with this idea that this looks like forms of casuistry. So then we went back and used a form of software, latent derelict analysis. We used topic modeling basically.
Which software do you use?
Well, we're having a fascinating conversation. We used one out of Stanford University, and it was clunky, I have to say. Had a conversation with Rob last night, and apparently there's a program within R that does this. That sounds like it's a cleaner tool. So I think we're gonna go back and do that. I have to say that I'm not particularly happy with the analysis that we did here. The other switch that I would say is that there is, because we're looking at changes over time, there is something called dynamic topic modeling analysis, which we're just learning about. So I'm going to apply that, but I have to say that I'm not really happy with the one we used. And so I'll ask the question back to you. Are you working in this area now?
Yes.
What are you using?
Well, we are doing a sentiment analysis, so it's a little easier. It's binary,
yes.
And we've used some off-the-shelf software tools.
Okay.
But we also want to redo the analysis we conducted with the new tools introduced by new sentiment analysis tool introduced by Google. But of course, a sentiment analysis is easier because it's binary than this content.
Although it could be more nuanced than it is. It doesn't have to just be binary, right?
Well, the one we did so far is binary.
Okay.
But
there is another off-the-shelf one that we looked at, Harvard 4, which does a whole series of different types of emotions. There's also one. There was a publication in ASQ by a guy last year out of his name's Shavin Malhotra. He's from Waterloo, and they used a technique that looked at they did a textual analysis of CEOs, and they looked at emotion and personality using some off-the-shelf software as well.
So the good news is, in the analysis we did, my colleague is right there, the various off-the-shelf packages we used, Semantria, iFeel, that are free, plus some meant for corporate use. So for a fee, we use Lexalytics. They all came up with similar results.
Okay.
So I think what's out in the market now is all very comparable.
Okay. So then it becomes ease of use and ease of presentation, which we also struggle with in these papers.
But actually, it also becomes keeping up with ongoing development, because the tool that I mentioned now that Google just introduced seems to have essentially leapfrogged all the other previous tools. So
this is the
so
other
any
problem.
analysis you've done is obsolete within 6 months.
It's so true. I was relating how I got introduced to I used to be entirely mistrustful of content analysis tools because it was all based on frequency, as you know. And I think it's just ridiculous to say that just because someone says I'm sorry 10 times makes them 10 times more sorry than someone who says it more emphatically once, right? Or to adopt the attitude of your current president, if you repeat a statement long enough that it becomes truer over time. I don't think that's true, but the technology now is way more sophisticated in drawing semantic networks between topics. That's what I'm really interested in. I was introduced to this by a really bright Swedish student about 6 years ago, doing a postdoc with me. She went and presented at a conference, I believe in Chicago, got a job at Google, and now she can't talk about what she does. But I think if there is something that's going to come, the Google software is going to be, I mean, they use that software to review all of our social media to anticipate what we're going to need in the future. Right?
I think what's tricky also is that these software tools rely on dictionaries that are specific for certain contexts. So the political context may require a different dictionary. We analyze financial documents, and those require specific dictionaries because such a simple word as restatement is negative in the financial world, whereas it's neutral in the normal world. So
that's true. Although my understanding of the and again, this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding of the technology now is that there is automated learning that takes place. So that if you construct the initial dictionaries, the machine will refine those over time itself. Of course, you have to keep checking to make sure that it's actually doing that.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to have the right dictionary to begin with, and then the machine learns.
Well, a related but slightly different question. One area I've always been interested in, which links to the dictionary, is software that can be better than we researchers or historians at figuring out what the key themes are. And with proximity, you get proximity analysis, you start seeing that a little bit. But I wonder whether you've come across some software that will really generate new insights as opposed to validate the ones we have.
Sadly, no. In fact, it's quite the opposite. That what I find these tools really useful for is dealing with large volumes of textual data. It used to be it was really hard to get large volumes of textual data, but now we can do that. So at this point, I think that the problem is that the topic modeling analysis tool that we use generates all kinds of potential topics, and as you know, you have to go back in and tell it what topics you want to focus on. So it doesn't absolve you of the interpretive function. And in fact, in many cases, it makes it harder because it gives you a whole range of possibilities to choose from. So I'm working with one of my PhD students who's interested in the emergence of the discourse of local food. And she has literally millions of documents that she's dealing with. And the problem is that the machine generates, in the first round, it generated over 100 topics that are viable themes. You can't write a thesis, let alone a paper, on 100 themes. So it still requires you to impose yourself or your interests, I guess, on the data. And while I think that may come over time, I don't think we're there yet.
Great, thank you.
Okay, it's a fascinating area, and I wish I were younger. So this idea of casuistry is that you take an existing idea and you alter it, much in the same way that we saw in the example of the repeated horses analogy, that you want to introduce new elements while maintaining some degree of continuity in the idea. And that's why I like this as a construct for this, because it has this notion of continuity and change in semantics embedded in the construct. In this context, our idea of rhetorical history is when you take an event or idea in the past that's reinterpreted in the present to have a slightly different meaning, or even better, that is reinterpreted in the present with a view to the future to have a slightly different meaning. And it is this temporal fluidity that I'm absolutely interested in theoretically at the moment. So this idea of separating, I think the phrase that's more commonly used in the literature is this idea of dissociation, where you take a category that you think is established and well understood, and you introduce a sense of division into it, either a critical one or a subtle one.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you think that happens in academia. Thinking back to this morning when you got the review that said you have no idea what Suddaby meant in this paper. Is that a function of I've interpreted what you said in my paper, and then Rob writes a paper that he didn't actually go back and read your paper. He saw what I said that you said, and then that became reality for him. And then Isabel writes a paper based on what she read in Rob's paper, none of which have really gone back and read your originally. Do you think that happens in academia?
Absolutely it does, and this is a very postmodern idea that once those ideas out there, even though you may have had intention A for that idea, the discourse takes on a life of its own, and what you thought you wrote, it's entirely possible that I didn't understand what I first wrote. You really have to, and that's why it's so important to keep up with the conversation, because my memory of what I wrote is 15 years old, right? And the way it's been interpreted is far, far, far more important than what I thought I said. No question. So in that sense, the reviewers are right. I mean, I think they're wrong in the sense that they misunderstood what I said, but they're right in the sense that they're controlling the conversation. Good point.
So it's gone from being Roy Suddaby's thought to Roy Suddaby's thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is sad. and that's exactly the point that we see in this context. And the problem that the CCP has here is that Mao Zedong is an icon. He's a god. He is the guiding ideology of the country and of the CCP. The problem that they have is that the Cultural Revolution was an unmitigated disaster. The Cultural Revolution was designed to stamp out all of these emerging capitalist practices that started to pop up all over the country to solve a very significant problem. That was that agriculturally and manufacturing context, the country was not keeping up. It was just not competitive. So the challenge is that they have to shift the conversation away from Mao Zedong's ideology without denigrating the person himself. And because if they do that, they know that so much of the legitimacy of the CCP is based on his history that the whole thing will collapse. And so that's exactly what they do, is they abstract Mao Zedong's thought to something called Mao Zedong thought. What I'm really fascinated by, and that's, in a sense, that's a retrospectively, I guess it's a relatively obvious strategy. What I really love is the incredibly detailed process that they went through to do this. So Deng Xiaoping realizes that this is a problem. He forms a team of 20 writers led by this Kuan Yu guy, who is the top CCP theoretician. Did I touch something?
I'm looking at, so I'm trying to look at the comments are up there.
If there are comments that you want to raise, feel free to interrupt me. Anyway, it goes through this long editorial process of refining and refining the scientific formulation that they want to use. And they come up with this idea that we should not exaggerate Comrade Mao's mistake. If we exaggerate, we'll smear the reputation of Mao Zedong, which will smear the reputation of the party in the country. And they come up with a scientific formulation. They said that Mao Zedong was about 80% right, about 20% wrong. I don't know how they come up with this number, but this is the idea of casuistic separation that they have. And what we have, and I haven't, one of the other things we struggled with is how to present the results of topic modeling analysis. So we ended up using this VOS viewer thing. We had to go back to the publishers or the owners of this particular software, and they were very, very helpful. What we would like to do is to show this in a time series analysis. And we haven't done that yet in this, but if we were to do that, what you would see is a sort of a separation of Chairman Mao, the red dot, and Mao Zedong thought over time. At the very beginning of the analysis, they're overlapping, and then they gradually move together. This is a summation or an average of over the years. But if we were to show this as a movie, you would see that starting to separate with time and discourse. The opposite of separating is combining, and that is to take two ideas that were once diametrically opposed or somewhat contradictory and bring them together.
This is just before I forget. Do you know Gapminder, Hans Rosling's platform?
No.
So he does a lot of time sequential modeling of data.
Okay.
And he has one that he has is of sort of life expectancy and GDP in countries over time. And so you can show how countries are moving through time in this. And I would think your data is, you have the thought, you have its various positioning on the dimensions over time. that his software, which is available on gapminder.com,
How do you spell it?
Gap, G-A-P,
M-I-N-D?
M-I-N-D.
All one word?
All one word, gapminder.com.
Who looked for that?
And it's a public access
Oh, beautiful.
software, because his daughter now, man, he passed away, but interesting, so it's like, his daughter, what you talked about, said that you could only do this as a public access service in a country like Denmark, or Sweden, Denmark,
Yeah.
because they didn't have any need for profits. Their
You got a good
Social Security was
social net.
secure, so they could
Yeah,
make
yeah.
it freely available.
Oh,
But it might actually address
The problem
visually
we have
your
here.
problem.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. See, this has been profitable already. The other one is to combine two incompatible things in the same idea. Here we have this idea of maintaining communism with capitalist practices. So they come up with this phrasing, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is very, very popular out there. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to have to speed up here. Again, the fascinating part for me is not the fact that it happens, but the incredibly intricate and detailed and thoughtful process and long process that this occurs. First appears in a speech of Deng Xiaoping in the 12th Congress in 1982. Then it gets pushed back a while, then it pops up again in a book in 1987. And the nice thing about this is that when these phrases become formalized, then you can see them diffuse through the newspaper organs that they have to disseminate this material. And if we had access to it, like I imagine on social media. The phrase actually comes from a guy called Zhao Ziyang, and he, of course, had to hide from Mao Zedong for a long period of time, and has now written an English version of his biography where he talks about this idea of combining. The other thing that is nice about Ziyang's strategy is he adopts this rhetorical strategy of periodization that's used by historians, by our financial people, and that is that he argued that the first 35 years of socialism that we tend to focus on is the history of China as a country, of the CCP, was just the primary stage, and now they're going to an advanced stage, and the socialism with Chinese characteristics is the extended version of what we're seeing. This is an effort to rhetorically naturalize what you're seeing. This is not unnatural. This is just part of a longer process. You have to watch it unfold in a kind of a natural evolutionary way that it's going to be. And this idea is to capture the notions of capitalism within the broader umbrella of socialism. And so you see this phrase, socialism with Chinese characteristics, pop up. And what you also see happening over time, again, if we could show the time series analysis, which I think we'll be able to, is to have it start shifting toward the conversation that's taking place in the blue, which is where you see other words that we tend to associate with capitalism, but we're not allowed under the old regime. Market economy, production, positivity, company, creativity, and eventually we'll see the word private properties, or property, not private property, but property pop up in that context. The other strategy, and this is probably closer to the analogy in that anecdote about the horses and zebras, is a gradual shift in language in a sequential way over time. And so what we see is a shift from planned economy at the beginning of the era, 1976, to this phrase social market economy, which is quite prominently used today, but there's a whole series of intervening words that occur. So the word planned economy shifts to something called the planned economy as primary, market economy as auxiliary. That pops up in 1982. It's drafted by Chen Yun, who has this brilliant metaphor of the birdcage economy, which he says that the economy is like a bird, and if you hold it too tightly in the hand, it's going to die. That's what communism has done. So we should let it fly, but only within the cage of socialism with the Chinese characteristics, basically. Which is again, a brilliant way of framing a relaxation of the controls of the market economy that existed. Then it moves from planned economy as primary to something called a planned commodity economy. And these shifts in language actually reflect the gradual introduction of capitalist practices in the economy that start with agricultural experimentation, typically in the fringes outside of the main, up in Mongolia, places closest to Hong Kong. Then it shifts to retail products primarily. They're going to benefit the everyday peasant consumer, as they say. And they say it will never happen on an industrial level, but then eventually it goes to the industrial level. And then they start using these phrases like the state needs the market guides the enterprises. And eventually, by 1992, they wind up with this phrase, the socialist market economy. And again, just another chart to try and represent that. The final one is stretching, to use the same word, but to stretch the meaning, the content of the word over time. Private property is not a word that there are attempts, you can see attempts to introduce private property into the discourse, but they're always rejected. Private ownership always gets rejected. So in this case, they take the existing phrase of the public ownership system and they adapt it over time to include things that we now recognize as elements of private property, including owning shares in corporations. Their argument is that the corporations are still structured under the Birdcage Economy, so the CCP has an interest in all the corporations, so it is technically still qualifies as part of the context of the public ownership system. And so in this context, what you would see in a time series analysis is the word public ownership system stays intact, but its network of connections to different meanings will change quite dramatically over time. I want to wrap this up quickly because I want to get more feedback from you so that I can get this thing eventually. But I think what we're trying to say here is that this clever idea of rhetorical history is being put into practice in a brilliant way here, where what is important is obviously the changes in practices that happen, which are actually quite profound. But the language doesn't change as quickly as the practices. The language is designed to change in this gradual, sort of evolutionary, almost continuous way to maintain a sense of continuity, or a feeling of continuity in the population, while the world is changing very, very rapidly. I'm going to stop talking because I want you guys to give me more of these clever ideas, like how to and I'm going to steal them all. But how to present the data is critically important.
So I guess my question is, why do you think this was rejected?
The catchphrase that, well, there are two reasons. There's the reason that they give, which they don't see the contribution. There's partly phrased in the sense of fit. This is too political sciencey and less organizational. I disagree with that. They also say that there is no contribution to theory. And this is where they quote me back. Well, we already knew this from rhetorical strategies legitimacy. We're obviously going to convince Suddaby. and based on the interaction we had, maybe there's an element of truth to that. So they don't see the novelty in it, and that's entirely possible. I think the real reason that we get into this is that this may be more novel in a different context. It may be more novel if I sent it to an international business journal. And I don't know. Do you have an answer for that?
Well, I mean, it's just my sixth sense. It's not. I don't have a certain answer, but it strikes me it's one of those cases in which that presents a research that crosses boundaries. You know, it's history and political science and organizational behavior and communication and rhetoric. So it's hard to categorize.
That's. I think you've nailed it there. I think the other thing that I did inappropriately was I kind of pee all over the institutional theorists at the beginning of this, and they didn't like that very much. And so then they say, well, this isn't really an institution. It doesn't have an organizational component to it. And my comeback is that the organization is the CCC, but they don't seem to like that.
I also would venture to say that it's a, as much as it is a hot topic, it's a scaldingly hot topic.
Yes.
Meaning, when I did my thesis, it was on his German author, and it was 88. So because there are some topics that are not the right time in
That's
that
true.
point of time in history.
And what I'm finding now in the management journals is that there are a lot of so-called China experts that are trying to dominate the conversation. And that's so you're right, the context has been an issue.
One of the things we were talking about yesterday when we were chatting a little bit about paper in the office is this kind of requires somewhat complete control of the narrative if you're going to use this strategy to institute change. And so I wonder
How generalizable this is.
how generalizable it is. So if you're a supreme government, this is a
Great
model
for
change
totalitarian
that you can use.
Yeah.
But what is it applicable in actual organizational context?
That's a good point, and one of the reviewers actually did say that. I think that's true. The reaction I had on that was to say this is an extreme case of the persuasive language that we see every day in advertising, for example. But,
Yeah, it seems to me that two things that one is from your presentation, I didn't get a strong sense of the centrality of the CCP as an organization. There isn't much of sort of the dynamic.
are you suggesting I actually listen to the reviewers? You might be there.
So for example, a little bit more history of the CCP, the leadership structure of the CCP. You mentioned individuals, but where they fit in the org chart,
Yes.
and how that might help ground it. I think
that's true.
the second is that drawing on Anthony's point is that I think it then does push to frame this as here's where we can see something because it is so blatant and obvious.
Mm-hmm.
But these kinds of control strategies happen in more subtle ways, because I think actually, contrary in some ways to what you said, I actually think that organizations have a tremendous amount. The CCP is not unique.
Right.
If you think about Google and its ecosystem, or Amazon and its ecosystem, or right, so that I think actually we like to pretend that we're not like the CCP, these organizations, but in fact they are very totalitarian in many respects. So trying to pull out kind of that, it's not just applicable. And then the last is just an analogy. I wrote with my wife a paper on biodiversity loss in bees and international business strategy, focusing on the global trade and bumblebee industry. And it was written with entomologists and business people, and trying to find a journal that wanted enough entomology to explain why it mattered,
Yeah.
but also wanted enough business, was willing to accept enough business.
Right.
It was very.
Did you find one?
Yeah, we did, in environment and organizations, but it took 3 different journals of sort of saying, no, this doesn't quite work, no, this doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
It took 5 years to
Which
get that
goes back to
published.
this point about it is hard to publish interdisciplinary.
You just have to be willing to do the long term. You may have to go through, but your process of it, your comment on improving, right? The feedback we got, even though they said this isn't right for us, the feedback we got as to why they couldn't understand what we were trying to say was extremely valuable for reframing it. And so each step it got much better. It was a much better paper at the end than it was in the first draft, but it took a while in a couple of journals to get it.
That's reassuring. Question there.
The first thing was I'd love to see an analysis like this where you compare the narratives, Mao Zedong narrative and the Steve Jobs narrative.
Yeah.
I just think there's some, anyways, might be some organizational insights to be drawn from that. But anyways,
We should do that. That's a good one. I like that.
Class yesterday.
I think we come from different sources, but I think it's a remarkable
Yeah.
complementarity. Anyway, the thing that I thought, and I don't know, I keep throwing out from my perspective as opposed. The thing that's exceptional, I think it's interesting that you pointed out the mechanisms that are being used, but that the thing that's exceptional from my perspective in this case is actually the functionality of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And the thing that would, I think, strike me in particular is Right, I mean, this story, this is a favorite story, really, that we have this idea that once organizations, maybe this isn't true in the business side of organizations there, I don't know, but once organizations assume a kind of identity and are constructed in a way to become rationalizing entities, right, become more efficient producers of the outcomes they're intending to produce, they lose the ability to recapture that original, separate, different form, the original sort of purpose, the original function, right? Yeah. And it seems to me that the Communist Party has somehow managed to both have this mass organizational rationalization process and yet retain this kind of control over their underlying function and purpose. It's easy to say, well, it's a totalitarian thing. They're a massive, that's all-encompassing organization that has somehow managed to retain this. And from a political science perspective, the story is there's these rare occasions where what are called endogenous institutions are formed. And it seems so the dominant story would be you've got this rationalizing enterprise and there needs to be some exogenous shock that
That's the typical narrative, yes.
But there's something about the Chinese organization, a quasi-parameter they would call it, Grayson Layton's paper that really sort of is there's something within that organization that is exceptional. It's responsive, or it's able to move in such a way that it can actually accommodate changes in its context in a way that, like the Soviet Union or other organizations don't. And that to me is what's exceptional. And this tactic is like the manifestation of that, right?
That's really, really helpful. So one thing, let me say what I think I hear you saying, and you tell me if this is right. So maybe the answer is to frame it in the sort of historical origins of institutional theory as a story of, we tend to think of changes like this as a loss of authenticity, a mission drift that's taken place, but they've managed to pull it off in the same way that the TVA did it, as Selznick described it when he was looking at how the outside interests co-opted the initial intent of the TVA and still made it successful, but the functionality was there.
Right? Yeah, and I think that's but then it actually is more comfortably also a normative paper, right? I mean, in the sense that you're not saying, hey, we should try to emulate communism because they're capable of suppressing dissent. You say, actually, we should emulate communism or we should emulate the Chinese party organization has got these features that are really beneficial for any organization, a mass organization like this.
Yeah, particularly the managing the continuity and change thing. But you see the same problem. So we have a similar paper. I don't know if we haven't had feedback on this one yet, but we look at the fair trade coffee movement, which starts out with this core mission of protecting the small owner farmer, but over time they get this rationalization pressure to make more and more money. And so if you want to get into Safeway or Tesco, maybe you should just compromise a little bit on what is actually fair trade coffee. Maybe include the plantation owners because we need to get the volume. But if you get the volume, your original purpose will be great because you have all this money, but you sort of lose the heart of what you really intended to do over time. In this case, it may be a comparable. Yeah.
I don't know what the story is. I mean,
I like
people
that.
like to talk to about it, I think, but I just think that, I mean, maybe they would then say it's even more to political science. I don't know, but I think.
Well, it is, but maybe we should try political science too. I'm not averse. There's a question here, and I'll come back.
Yeah, it was two more comments and the question building on what Rob said and Mark said as well. I think to me, but I come not from political science, from history and strategy. I like the idea of framing the party as an organization and really having that as a base. And maybe the two areas that you could push it to, one is absorptive capacity.
Okay, how so can you?
Absorptive capacity
Yeah, I know.
is the ability of organizations to absorb new knowledge and shock. And I wonder whether that's, on the adaptation.
Is there a parallel term to absorptive capacity in political science? Not really.
I'm actually really not familiar with exactly what you're talking about.
No, but I think we're talking about
It is. It sounds like the same thing. Yeah, I know a little bit about absorptive capacity. I would say it is related. Yeah, that's good.
So that's one area.
Yeah, I like that.
Also, the interaction between strategy and the communication of change is another anchor that would be interesting.
Yeah, that was my original reaction when we got the rejection, because I'm of course interested in communication strategies and institutions. Yeah.
The limit I see to that, to go back to your original comment about, how relevant is it to business? I think the problem here is we have a top-down approach. It's really, I was fascinated reading the paper because I do a lot of similar things, but on the side of sense-making,
Yes.
where the actors themselves are doing that process of intuition, reinterpretation, reframing, whereas here it's really top-down.
More sense telling, isn't it? You should use that phrase. Anthony,
Yeah, I don't have a super clear thought here, so I'm just going to talk. There's a lot of work on structure and how you would predict that a highly bureaucratic, multi-layered organization, and I can't think of any more highly bureaucratic organization than the Chinese government, would not be able. The current theory would predict that they would absolutely fail
Yes.
at absorbing these. This
is your point, isn't it? Yes, absolutely.
And
Yeah,
so,
but it hasn't.
This is actually, I don't know if you frame it this way, but it's like everything we think we know about bureaucracy's ability to deal with massive shocks is wrong. Actually, there is a way in which that can be handled, and we demonstrate that for you.
And that's consistent with your original point about Weber, right? Because he would have made that prediction, and it's actually not true. Yeah. Man, this is being incredibly valuable. Thank you.
But it looks like from an organizational point of view, you have some strategy going on as well. But for the most part, you find it around institutional theory or political risk, political.
Which may have been a mistake in retrospect.
Well, I wonder, so I'm seeing that there may be something going on in the debate about informal institutions, which I haven't seen as an element that much yet in the study. And I think that would definitely make a difference.
Yeah.
Frame the language part on informal institutions and say how that matters to revolutionary change.
Yeah, although that framing could be absorbed into the conversation that's going on here, because the point is that this is an example of formal institutions that actually change, possibly through informal processes.
Yeah. Informal institutions, and then you have more leverage on the institutional theory side.
Yeah. So I like what I'm hearing, and that one is that you like the story, but the framing could use some work, the overall structure of the framing. That's certainly the feedback we're getting from reviewers as well.
Maybe there's several papers.
Yeah,
But that's important
I think what
because there's a political piece, there's a business piece, management, and then there's the historical piece. I'm always finding as a historian a real challenge to frame it in a way that people get, because you get channeled to, as you said this morning, to an expert that is going to look at it from its perspective. The moment you have two, let alone three pieces, it gets really complicated to.
Is there a journal in political science that would be interested in this? Not in this, but in the conversation we're having about formal bureaucracy.
I have to see. I mean, the thing is, I don't know too much about where the Chinese government scholarship, which is its own kind of.
I'm sure they have their own journal.
This is like mainstream. Biggest are. I mean, if there's extensions of this that I can think of that are, because there's the other side of it, which is not only did they manage their bureaucracy, they managed their bureaucracy in a way that it actually maintained a kind of equilibrium in which they didn't face popular revolt, despite the fact that they were fundamentally transforming their image. And that is really where there's a lot of action there in terms of like how authoritarian states function.
Okay, so I'll consider that. That would be the option.
The other angle here would be communication. Some sort of communication journal.
Well, that was the preference for this. Although I thought that the mainstream management journals would be interested in communication, it didn't seem to be that much. They find that the least interesting part. And in fact, again, the feedback I'm getting is that we already have the rhetoric stuff, so we don't need any more. So I find that discouraging actually, because particularly in the context of institutions, there used to be this group at they actually called it the Toronto School of Communication Studies, and that's where Harold Guinness came out of it, Marshall McLuhan, all those folks, and they talked about the connection between communication strategies and institutional change. I mean, that's all been lost.
I mean,
Bless you.
It really, I find it kind of, for whatever reason, I've been being exposed more to how the party organization, Chinese party organization works. Like, it really is, there's this idea that there's a kind of cult of personality going on, and it really is not at all what the story is. And it's much more organized and bureaucratic and structured than that, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's not a charismatic leadership thing, like even to go back to the Weber thing. It's not about that. It's about something else.
Yeah, and you could make it as a story of the success of formal bureaucracy. Yeah, I like that.
Not that I really want to celebrate bureaucracy too much, but
no, it'll. Well, I want to. Weber's my god, so I want to celebrate that. But it makes me look as old as I am, and that's not good. But I mean, it's kind of. Every academic gets to that stage in their career where they want to take things back to when they were young. And in my case, that would be back to 1919, right?
But ironically on that, as I was listening to a paper, I was thinking, I could have seen it published in the Annals, the French Annals.
Oh, yes, and the Annals, yes.
That's politics and semantics and history, as you know.
No, I'm Canadian, my French is terrible. So.
One more question. We're already 10 minutes over.
Yes.
Anybody, is there one more question?
I have a quick question, if I could.
Yes, God.
Yes, God.
And I apologize. It's focusing on a superficial aspect of your presentation, but it happens to be on my mind at the moment, and it ties together your two presentations today. So I'm currently going back and forth with a co-author about the title of a paper we're submitting.
Yeah.
Between either a mildly tongue-in-cheek title or a purely descriptive title. And I just noticed, the title on your presentation was quite colorful, and I wonder if that's the one you used to submit with, and if you recommend that, and if you have any thoughts around that.
It is, and we've gone back and forth about the title, which I agree is a little bit provocative, and including that anecdote at the beginning. We've had mixed reviews to the anecdote as well. I think this is the one area that I am absolutely the worst at, and that is selecting a title. And I think that there is a real art to selecting a title that does both of those things, that's provocative and descriptive at the same time. I wish I could offer some advice on how to fix that, but I'm just really bad at it. This is not something I'm good at. So if you or anyone has suggestions on the title, they haven't said this is a terrible title, but they have said we should rethink putting the anecdote in at the beginning. So if anyone has any suggestions for a better title, obviously it's going to change. If I follow the strategy of focusing on the formal bureaucracy, the title's going to change a bit. But I wish I could answer that question, but I can't.
Okay. Thanks very much. It's helpful just to hear your perspective.
How a bunch of people managed to paint the zebras together.
All right, thank you guys.
Great. Thanks very much. Really helpful comments.